Be alarmed. We have it set to record only those of us who are unmuted and talking into the yellow box. So you will not be picked up and put into that recording for posterity. Just the presenters and David and myself. Please do make use of the chat box at any point throughout the evening. We will be having an audience question and answer session at the end of the event. So any questions that you put in there, we will save up, and David and I will pose those for you at the end of the evening. And then last and not least, before we introduce our authors, a thank you, all of you. Times are still hard for independent businesses, small businesses, independent bookstores. It's not been an easy year. We've been doing these virtual events for almost exactly a year now. And we couldn't do what we do without all of you. Your continued support of the bookstore, not just in coming to events, but in shopping with us, has sustained us through a hard year and kept us going. And we are deeply aware of that and grateful for your continued support. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to David to introduce our authors this evening.
Thanks so much, Rachel. We've got a really special event here tonight. Wendy Garling is here to present her new book, The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, The Extraordinary Life of Mahaprajapati. She is a writer, mother, gardener, independent scholar, an authorized Dharma teacher with a BA from Wellesley and an MA in Sanskrit from UC Berkeley. She's also the author of Stars at Dawn, Forgotten Stories of Women in the Buddha's Life. Her latest, The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, has been called a work of exceptional scholarship that reads like a well-honed novel, an important contribution filling a major gap, and a no-brainer for historians. We're lucky to be joined by Vanessa R. Sasson, author of Yasodhara and the Buddha, a novel about the Buddha's wife. Vanessa is a professor of religious studies at Marianapolis College in Canada. Reviewers have said that Yasodhara and the Buddha combines the spirit of fiction with the beauty of Indian mythology and in-depth academic research. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Vanessa R. Sasson and Wendy Garling.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having us. It is my great pleasure to be here to also welcome Wendy and to be her conversation partner as we explore her book, which I have sitting here right next to me if you haven't bought it. Oh, you can't see it because of my, it's not working. It's going in and out, but okay, forget it. I can't show it to you, but it's a beautiful cover. And if you haven't bought it, I really do recommend it. It's just, even just sensually to hold the book is a very nice experience. And just before I ask Wendy my first question, I thought I would ask all of you a tiny favor if you can. This is the professor, teacher, and me coming out. But if you guys would be willing to put on your cameras, it's so much nicer for those of you who are comfortable with it, because it feels much more communal and we don't feel like we're too alone in a room. But of course, everybody do as they're most comfortable. So Wendy, I'd like to open this by asking you if you could tell us a little bit about Mahaprajapati, tell us who she is, tell us a little bit about her story so that everyone in the room can have a sense of this conversation as we go.
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, to Northshire Books and to David and to Rachel and to Vanessa. And I'm so happy to be joined by all of you. And I hope everyone is well and getting through all this stuff we're going through together all right. I can show you the cover of my book because I don't have a fake background. So here's the cover of my book, which just came out 2 days ago. And what this is it's a story of the woman who raised the Buddha. And I will explain that a little bit in a minute. But this is a huge piece of the Buddha's life, this woman, Mahaprajapati, who was his adoptive mother. She is pretty much ignored in the traditional stories, so we don't know much about her. In fact, all we know in the common stories that come down to us is that she was the first Buddhist nun. And then in that context, there will usually be mentioned that, well, she was the aunt of the Buddha, she was his foster mother. But other than that, we really don't know in the conventional sources who on earth she was and anything about her. So that was my mission in writing this book. In my first book, I learned a lot about her, and then I was motivated to learn more and write the second book. because I feel she's so important. And like many women in history, she's been ignored and basically written out of the story of early Buddhism and the story of the Buddha's life. And the more I know about her and learn about her, the more I realize that that's really outrageous, because she was more than just his adoptive mother. She was a really unusual and special person. So what this book does is it begins with as much as I can find in the research materials, and this all comes from the early texts, about her earliest I can find life, which mostly I learn about through her sister Maya. But the book spans the entire arc of her life, and she lived a very long life to what she says at the end in her own autobiography is 120 years. So we don't know if she really lived that long, but what I have realized about that is there is no one who really followed the whole emergence of Buddhism like she did. Not only was she his adoptive mother, but she was there on the scene for everything that unfolded. And I think that's just another reason it's really a travesty that we don't know more about her. So I'm hoping that this book will bring her back. And I'm hoping to kind of change the fact that no one not only knows anything about her, but about the women in early Buddhism. So I can go on, Vanessa.
Well, how about you set the stage by telling us also a little bit about her story? So you say that she's the stepmother. Could you tell us how she enters the story, and because many people might not be aware of that,
Right.
and who follows?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to change my setting here. Hold on. Okay, I think that's all right. Yes, so how did she become his adoptive mother? That's a good question. Some of you who are familiar with the Buddha's life story might know some of the answer to that. You know, David, if you can help me, I can only see Vanessa. Is there any way I could see myself? So when I'm
Sure
speaking?
thing. So let's say, why don't you try to make it in the top right-hand corner? If you can see view, you can click gallery view, and you can see the pane of everyone's faces.
Right.
And then if you click speaker view, it'll just sort of focus on the one person who's speaking, and I'll switch back.
So even if I'm speaking, it should show me? Okay, it's not
right.
showing me. Okay, I'll try that again. All right. All right. So I still don't see me. I see David, but
Let me see what I can do. Hold on.
it's distracting.
How does that work?
You have to get to gallery view. If you can click on gallery view.
I'm in.
I've tried to pin you here too. I don't know if that works for everyone. Let's see.
All right. Well, I don't want to slow things down. Let me get started. So the reason she's his adoptive mother, this goes back to the birth of the Buddha. First of all, I'll introduce the Buddha's birth mother. She was Queen Maya, and many of you who know the story of Buddhism will know that. She was married to the king, King Suddhodana. In those days, kings had harems, and his second wife was Mahaprajapati, who was Maya's sister. So the two sisters were co-wives to the king Suddhodana. And that was very common in those days with the aristocratic ruling classes. And there's a whole lot of stories about harems and so forth, but these two women were the chief wives of King Suddhodana. So Maya gets pregnant and chooses to go to the birthing grove where women went to give birth, and they went with other women. It was a sacred spot that was really only women were allowed access, and that's where they helped each other in childbirth, and they did ritual. And the goddess was presumably presided over, or the birthing grove was presided over by a goddess. Anyway, Queen Maya is pregnant. She and the women depart for the Lumbini's grove, and Mahaprajapati accompanies her. Now that detail is usually completely not in the narratives, but I can tell you she went along, she was there. The birth happens very quickly when they arrive, and what is captured more in the art than in the literature is that as Maya is giving birth, she's holding the branch of the tree. She's standing with her right hand, and her sister Mahaprajapati is supporting her on the left. And in this moment, the Buddha is born. At that time, his name was Siddhartha. What I love about that image of the three of them is that it really captures how I feel Buddhism unfolds, because very shortly after that, Maya dies. And essentially, even though the narratives, the mythology doesn't really admit it, it's pretty clear she died from childbirth. So she dies within days. And what I love about that image is it's as if the two mothers are giving birth together to the Buddha, because Maya dies and immediately the Buddha is handed, I mean, we don't have the exact scenario, but the Buddha is given to Mahaprajapati, who has her own child. So she is able to nurse the Buddha, and she takes the Buddha to her breast. And at that moment, she becomes his adoptive mother. So as you see, it was really from the beginning that she was his mother, the only mother he ever knew. And unfortunately, Maya is also completely written out of the stories. Once she does her job, she gives birth to the Buddha, she's gone. And in my first book, I work hard to find sources that kind of bring her back more as sort of a, well, she comes back as sort of an angelic or goddess being who looks over her son. Some of the literature preserves her in that role, although there's no question that her physical body died in childbirth. So that's when Mahaprajapati's whole life changed. Suddenly, she's not second fiddle to her sister, but she's now the chief queen to King Suddhodana, and she's the mother of the Buddha. And I want to read a few passages because there's not much about the childhood, but what we find in the sources when we find anything is the incredibly close, loving bond between Mahaprajapati and Siddhartha, the baby. And the languaging in so much of the literature calls her, oh, the foster mother, oh, his aunt. And those really bother me because I think they have served to distance the emotional relationship that Mahaprajapati really had with the Buddha, her son. And in my book, I start out right on the first page, and I say, I call them both his Maya and Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's mother. It's just Maya gave birth with her womb, and Mahaprajapati took him to her breast, and they both were in a sense co-mothers. And I don't use the other languaging unless I need to differentiate. So there's a couple of passages I want to read that I found, and these are all from the Sanskrit source, or at least the first ones are, and they're very poetic and they're very beautiful, and the literature is very much like that. What did I do with my glasses? Here we go. Then the queen's sister, undistinguished from the real mother in her affection or tenderness, brought up as her own son, the young prince, who is like the offspring of the gods. Another text says, she attended him without intermission, as the sun tends on the moon during the first portion of each month, till the moon arrives at its fullness. So the child gradually waxed and increased in strength as the shoot of the banyan tree gradually increases in size, well planted in the earth till itself becomes a great tree. Thus did the child day by day increase, and he lacked nothing. And another verse, the child causing his loving mother always to abound in the most nutritious milk, so that even supposing it were not sufficient naturally, it became more than enough through his influence. And I'm going to read you another passage about the bond between them. But what's special about this passage is now we fast forward to the end of her life. So now she's presumably 120 years old, and there's a story that's told on the last day of her life. And this is her final conversation with the Buddha. And this is what she says to him. Oh, my son, earlier when you were young, you played games fit for a child here and there outside the palace, surrounded by 80,000 princes like a miniature full moon surrounded by stars. And I would look for you, and not finding you in the royal compound, I would search here and there. And when I found you, I would pick you up in my two hands, and placing you against my breast, I would protect you from the rain, the wind, the heat, and the cattle. Taking you back inside the palace, I would lie down on sumptuous beds, and I would pacify you, putting you against my stomach and make you fall asleep. I gave to you who are incomparable the ordinary attention paid to a child that all mothers of the world give to their children. So this is a theme that you find throughout all the stories. He always refers to her as my mother, when he talks about her or he talks to her, and she always refers to him as her son. So I think that's a very important missing piece of the Buddha's story and the Buddha's biography, because when you read the kind of sterile conventional version, he's this solitary hero that goes off and achieves enlightenment, which of course is true, but there is so much more to the story than that. And he grew up with a very loving mother, where the more conventional stories would make you think he grew up kind of an orphan in his father's palace, which is not at all the case. And that this sort of sets the stage for their relationship as he gets older. So.
Thank you. I love your emphasis on, I have to admit, I never really recognized or thought about the fact that she always calls him, well, she always calls him my son, but that he always calls her his mother. I think I hadn't really paid attention to that detail in the literature until you pulled it out. And it's a very evocative detail. It really does anchor your argument that they're co-mothers more than one mother and one stepmother. It really makes the two women partners in raising the Buddha. It's a really beautiful thing to notice in the literature. Mm-hmm. But I'm struck as I'm listening to the pieces that you're reading, certainly something I've struggled with as I've read all of this literature over the years, is this idealization of this relationship. And I wonder if there's anything you can say to that, because it's this very beautiful, very lush picture of, you know, the child being safe in her arms and his love for her and her love for him. Motherhood tends to be much more complicated, and there's some yelling involved sometimes. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do we engage with literature that is so idealistic about motherhood? What does it mean?
Well, you know, it's not just motherhood. I think that the literature is idealized when it comes to talking about heroic figures anyway. At least in the stories I found, women were included. Usually it's just the men who are idealized and women don't exist. But to your point, there is certainly grief and sorrow and suffering in the Buddha's life story when you read about it. I don't recall that she yells at him. Mm-hmm. I think his father might, but the early stories are the tender stories of a young child and an adoring mother. When it comes time for him to leave home, everybody is suffering because the kingdom, you know, his father's upset, his mother's upset, his wife is upset, the kingdom knows he's leaving and they're worried they won't have an heir to take over. So there we see real grief and suffering. And Mahaprajapati in particular, now she's also the queen of the Sakyas, and we get detail on her sense of responsibility. So she feels that it's really, everybody's trying to keep him from leaving, but her job, she takes it very seriously. And one thing she does, which is kind of funny, but she goes into his harem. Of course, the Buddha had a harem too, which is underplayed in the more strict stories. But she's trying to arouse the women and saying, come on, do your job, do your job. You know, if you just keep him sort of satisfied, then he won't want to leave. And there's just sort of this sort of irony. But to me, it's also sort of, well, it also becomes in the end the women who set him free. It's kind of a big part of that story. But Mahaprajapati has terrible nightmares. And in the nightmares, she's grief-stricken about what's going to happen to him. She's not clinging to him so much out of an attachment, but she's worried, how is this princely figure going to survive when he starts sleeping on the ground in the rain and eating whatever, you know, berries that he can find. So she's more worried as a mother, but there's certainly, you know, that part isn't particularly idealized. You don't see her get angry. That's not a common emotion, but you see her otherwise very bereft. And when he does finally leave, there's one thread in the stories that's very moving, and that is that she weeps herself to the point of blindness. Yeah. And she resides in this place of blindness for 12 years until he comes home. And then there's this beautiful imagery and this beautiful story of when she finally sees him again. And Yasodhara, actually her daughter-in-law, takes this blessed water that has been emanating from some miracles the Buddha's been doing and washes Mahaprajapati's eyes, because Mahaprajapati is saying, what's going on? What's going on? I can't see him. And everybody's cheering him on. And she can't see what's going on. So Yasodhara, her daughter-in-law, the Buddha's wife, takes this holy water and washes Mahaprajapati's eyes, and then she can see. And it's It's very beautiful, and it's also, her life is starting over, because now she has lost Siddhartha. Siddhartha is gone, and that's part of the darkness that she was experiencing. But when she sees again, now he's the Buddha. So her relationship to him has changed, and yet there's always this tether. There's this inner thread of being his mother. But you see how he treats her differently, always feeling his deep love for her, but now he's the Buddha, so he has this sense of great love. So his rapport with her is more around sort of teachings and helping her to relinquish her attachment, because he knows ultimately that's, you know, the best for her. So yeah, it's idealized, but I think when you really dig deep in the sources that aren't as quite as cleaned up, you find a lot of the human story.
Beautiful. Such a good answer. I was hoping you were to talk about the scales on the eyes and the water pouring. It's such a beautiful image. It's so poetic. And what I love about that scene is that the women are suffering, and Mahapajapati she's blinded, and they don't ask the men for help, right? It's the two women kind of together standing there in this sea of men as the Buddha's performing the miracles and the Buddha's water is pouring, and they decide, oh, let's catch the water and wash her eyes. And then she sees. So it's this like really sweet moment where women just kind of take care of this situation by themselves. So I've always been struck by that scene.
Yeah.
So we have all this beautiful imagery of her as a mother. We see her a little bit messy sometimes. We see that she suffers. There's really complicated material about motherhood as being idealized in the literature, like we must love all our children. So there's all these Buddhist teachings that we have to love all beings the way a mother loves her child. And so the mother's love is kind of this pure idealized notion. But then we also get stuff of the mother is ultimately the embodiment of attachment, right? That because she has a child, she'll never be free because she will always be attached to her child. And so the mother is the epitome of the attached samsaric being, right? And so how does Mahapajapati get past that? How does she, or do you have any thoughts about what she represents as a mother who transcends motherhood maybe? Does she transcend motherhood, or is she always a mother?
Well, I think what you're describing doesn't apply as much to Mahaprajapati as to, for example, Yasodhara in terms of real attachment. Again, Mahaprajapati, when he was leaving, I didn't feel it was the selfish attachment, like, how could you do this to me? And that was more Yasodhara's response, the wife. How could you do this to me? That's what would be considered, in my view, attachment. She was worried about him and she didn't want him to go. So there was, of course, attachment. She wasn't a realized being, but I would say she embodies true mother's love in those scenes. And I'm not going to say that's not there. I'm not going to fabricate an attachment I don't feel was there. I feel she's embodying a true mother's love where she's really worried about, or she's looking out for the best interests of her son and worried about him. And I think we see that later also. So I don't feel that she really holds that kind of mother's attachment. I know it's fairly common, but also when he comes home, and he always promised he would. A lot of people miss that in the story. They think, oh, what a jerk. He abandoned his family and his wife and his son. And well, what is missing in the story that's so beautiful is he loves them so deeply that he can't stand to see the suffering of samsara, of their whole life cycle and all they're doing, especially all the sensuality in the harem. So when he makes this decision to leave, it's with this heartfelt love for his family, and he promises to return. So when he does return, it's because his father's kind of sent a messenger reminding him, you said you would come home, and the Buddha does. And at that time, I think there's a mix. She's definitely his mother, but she, of all the family members who respond to his return, is the least attached. She just loves him. And that to me is true mother's love. She just loves him. So he was Siddhartha, now he's a Buddha. She just wants to be in his presence. And she invites him to dinner. And this is in the women's quarters. And it would be really fun to be a fly on the wall and have watched that dinner. But she invites him to dinner to the women's quarters, and he brings all his monks. So you can imagine 100 monks showing up in their robes and their begging bowls to dinner in the palace in the women's quarters. And she's overjoyed. She's just had the whole place decked out and cleaned, and she made a special seat for him. And she's a queen, but it's emphasized that she serves him like a servant. She serves him with her own hands. And she never reprimands him or says, where the hell have you been? That maybe it's idealized, but that's the way the stories are told. And I think that there's Buddhist lessons, there's human lessons in them being told that way. I don't wish that she had, I don't wish that she'd been any different. I've learned a lot from who she was and how she responded to her son. And that there's many stories, the story I don't have that much time. You have to read the book, guys. But there are other stories where, there is a time of disappointment. One thing she does in another story thread is she makes him a beautiful robe during
I was going to ask you that. I was ready for the robe.
This is a different story thread, because in this story, she has not become blind. This is a whole nother Sanskrit Northern stories thread. But they capture this 12 years of grief in a different way. Mm-hmm. And it's so beautiful because she's this queen, but she devotes the entire 12 years to making him a really beautiful robe. And queens don't usually weave, they don't usually garden, they don't usually do any of this, but the whole point was she did it with her hands. And she planted the seeds to grow the cotton, and cotton was very sacred as a fiber there because it was so perfect in the heat. So she grew this beautiful cotton, and she tended the garden, and then she combed the cotton, and she spun the thread, and she wove it. So you get this detail, and it reminds you of the detail of the minutiae of being a mother, where you clean and you wash and you change and you're physically exhausted. Well, she went through sort of a period like that. And then when he comes home, she's got this incredibly beautiful robe that she's made for him. So in terms of attachment, yes. And that's a huge story. It's a whole chapter in my book, and I won't give it away. But she's so excited to present him with this robe. But he's the Buddha now. He's not Siddhartha. And so it's not like, here, honey, I made you this great robe. She offers it to the Buddha, and he immediately says, and remember, he's the Buddha, and he's giving her a teaching. He says, give it to the Sangha. And she just goes, wait a minute, I wanted the merit of giving it to you. And he goes, and he has beautiful things he says to her. And Ananda in one story intervenes and tries to talk him into it. And he says, give it to the Sangha. So in that story, you see her sadness where she expects him to behave as a son, but he's behaving as a Buddha. And she weeps in that story because she thinks he's actually denigrating her gift and not receiving it the way she intended. And so there is an attachment and disappointment, but wait till you read the end of the chapter. It's more than resolved. It's more than worked out. And you'll see that the Buddha was applying his Buddha wisdom, and he was not only really doing the right thing for her, he was doing the right thing for the Sangha and for actually Buddhism. It's a big story, a story that I claim is bigger than the Ordination Story. And I truly feel that way. It's much more important, and it's been totally buried. But it is a story that was thriving in the early centuries of Buddhism because it was recorded then. And it was recorded in various places, but it was recorded quite thoroughly. So we know this was an early story. And so we do see this angst of a mother, but I think it's played up to frame the story with that type of a beginning, and then it has a different kind of ending.
I think one of your great contributions with this book is that discussion of the robe. I think you're right that it's a scene, it's a section of her narratives that we really haven't paid attention to. And I knew about it. I had read the passages before, but I had never stitched it together quite the way you have. And so when I read that chapter, I sat back and I thought, oh, that's a whole other, it was like a whole other way of engaging with the material. And I really had to sit down and think about that for a while. It's a beautiful way of re-engaging a scene that we may really have missed for a very long time. So that's very exciting. I'm wondering whether you want to talk about the ordination story or not, and her role as a leader in that moment, or if that's too big of a topic, and we can go also, because the other part that I'd love for you to discuss a little bit is her death and her funeral, which is so important.
Right.
Her role in the ordination stories is just kind of her most famous moment.
Right. It's famous and it's been told many times, and I do address it, excuse me, in depth. But I'd like to back up a little bit because I found a really important series of stories that predate the ordination. And what was so important about these stories is she was a leader of the women years before she took them to the Buddha for ordination. And that's been completely lost.
Maybe you want to just explain this, because maybe not everybody knows what this ordination is.
Well, wait, I'll get to ordination. I'm going to tell the first story first. So again, when the Buddha returns to Kapilavastu, everybody's really excited to see him, and they are really excited to get Dharma teachings. And right off the bat, there's a problem because only men are allowed in the grove to hear the teachings, and the women were not allowed. Well, this wasn't something the Buddha did. This was something the patriarchal society decided. So there are these really touching, very engaging stories of the women being really pissed, and they complain. And some stories, they get very outspoken. So they end up going to Mahaprajapati and they say, "Can you help us here? We want to learn the Dharma. Why is the Dharma only for men?" And so there's different versions of it, but she then becomes the representative of all these women because she goes, "You're right." And first she talks to her husband because he's part of this patriarchy that set up the split. And he said, "Oh, no problem." And you see him in that conversation is very, very cooperative and very amenable. It's like it never occurred to him that women would want to hear the Dharma. In another version of that, she actually takes the women before the Buddha. And the women say, "They won't, the men didn't want us to attend your teachings." And the Buddha immediately lays out the 5 virtues of women. And that becomes kind of his corrective to the misogyny that has just emerged in the culture. So again, the Buddha is not that way, but he's dealing with this sort of patriarchal culture. So the point I'm making is that she led these women, she was the queen, these were her people, before the ordination. And at that time they took teachings with the Buddha, they became lay disciples. So for years they practiced as lay disciples together. And then when he returned a second time, they were ready for ordination. And it was also a time when many of their husbands were ordaining. So there was this social crisis because many of the families were left without their patriarchs and their protectors. So there was also a huge exodus of the women. And that's when she brought the women and led them to her son and represented their voice. Now, in my book, I acknowledge that this is a very well-researched area, and it's not necessarily up to me to explore new ground because I'm not a monastic, and I feel that story in many ways belongs to the monastic women, and the monastic community to sort it out, and they are doing a good job. Venerable Analayo and Venerable Dhammadinna, there's a lot of publishing around that issue. But I did look at every single ordination story I could find, and there were over 10 or 12. So what I did was look for little details that maybe weren't part of their issue, but maybe that would inform us. And so I felt there was a lot more to learn from the ordinations section. First of all, just that the Buddha, I honestly think it's totally fake news that he instituted 8 negative rules for women. That's just part of the pattern of putting words in his mouth to disparage women, and it's in total contradiction to other things that he says. And to me, it's in total contradiction to the fact that he's enlightened, because an enlightened being doesn't even hold those negativities within the sphere of their consciousness. So to me, that's just low-level misogyny kicking in later in the literature. So I don't even feel it's my wheelhouse to spend a lot of time on it. And I don't like to spend a lot of time on misogyny because I feel it was all fake news that was introduced later. So I spend time on stories that I feel are more affirmative of how the Buddha really taught and how he felt. And I think the most affirmative story comes right after his enlightenment, when he takes his first food and suddenly has this terrible colic and looks like he's going to die. And Mara, the demon, his nemesis, shows up and says, "Die, die, Buddha, die." And the Buddha says, oh no, I just attained enlightenment and my work is ahead of me. And I won't be ready to die until my work is complete. And my work is to establish a fourfold community equally of laymen, laywomen, monks, and nuns. And that's the fourfold Sangha, or the fourfold community. So that's what I refer back to as really the compass point. And I don't really dignify the misogyny too much. I feel like it's keeping it alive too long. It's giving it too much oxygen. But when you go back to the blueprint he made for his ministry, that women, laywomen and nuns would be equally taught the Dharma and would equally flourish in the Dharma. That plays out in a lot of the sutras. You see examples, and I put them in my book, where he really meant that, and he really did that. So there's a lot of contradiction if you put the misogyny next to that, but I don't believe the misogyny was his. So I kind of hand off the ordination problems to the monastics, especially the monastic women, because they're the ones who are calling it out. And people, amazing scholars like Analio, are doing really deep research and pretty much agreeing with what I'm saying, that that was later written in. And I think it's time to just not give it any more attention. Just let the oxygen out of those stories, because they're really painful, and they're really ugly.
They are very painful stories. But all right, so you're probably going to laugh at me for my question, because we've debated this question before, you and I. But the way you speak about these stories, I wonder how much of these stories do you believe are true historically? Because what's your relationship to these stories and the Buddha? You speak about him as though you believe he was real and he wouldn't have done this or he would have done that. What do we know of the Buddha and any of these characters, and how do we navigate the relationship between all of these stories that spanned all over Asia for centuries and this person that you're talking about? How do we do that?
That's a really big question. And
I know.
Well, I personally have no doubt he lived, and I don't even go there with, was he a mythological being? That's early European Orientalism, I believe, that started that rumor. I mean, I just don't believe all of this could have come out of some story someone made up at one point in time. So I don't even go there, but I believe he was a human being who evolved, and this is the basis of Buddhism really, who evolved his mind to the point of enlightenment. And I believe, I'm also a practicing Buddhist, but I believe enlightenment is real. And I believe that it is indeed a state beyond these negative, aspects of mind and so forth. So since I believe that, coming from my personal side, when I see this misogynistic nonsense put in his mouth, I can't take it seriously, because I can't, it just doesn't work with who I think he is. We all have our own take on that. So I'm just speaking from where I sit. In terms of what's true and what's historical, the miracle of washing her eyes. I mean, that's a good storyteller talking, right? It's a way to convey joy because she saw her son again. I know that, but I can get lost and just go weaving back and forth. You have to when you tell these stories. So my rule of thumb when I'm thinking, well, I believe he lived. In fact, I'll even say I know he lived. So when I find consistency, I kind of think maybe this is historical truth because it's in the Sanskrit tradition, it's in the Pali tradition. So one thing that's consistent, and I say this in the first paragraph of my book, is that Maya died in childbirth or thereabouts, and Mahaprajapati became his adoptive mother. That is consistent. So if you're asking me what I would accept personally as historical fact, I would say that must be, because there's no exception to that anywhere, not in art, not in, anywhere. So when you get to other issues like, well, especially when it comes to, harem issues and wives and how many he had, the Sanskrit tradition is much more, I think, daring in talking about he had more than one wife and so forth. And the Pali tradition tends to be more, I would call monastic, and they clean all that stuff up. So that's where we have to go back and forth and see who's telling the story what way. I also feel it's consistent everywhere that his enlightenment was attained at about the age of 35, about midlife. It's consistent that he lived to be about the age of 80. Mm-hmm. It's consistent to the extent that we hear about Mahaprajapati at all, that she lived out a long life and basically followed the arc of his life and died only a few months before he did, if we believe the Terry Apadana. I don't know if I believe it literally, but I believe she lived a long life because there's a lot of detail. So, I guess consistency is where I would say it might have happened. It might be actually fact. I don't even use the word fact anywhere in my book.
No, yeah.
But it's a big no-no. But and where there's inconsistency and where there's, magical thinking, and where there are Jataka tales, the Jataka tales are the past life stories. I don't have any problem holding all of it and weaving them together. Some people do, but I don't. And I think there's a lot of information. You can look at these sort of fantastic stories like the Jataka tales and say, well, this is, kind of magical thinking. It's got talking animals and talking elephants and stuff. But if you look deeply, there's often kernels of the real life story of the Buddha in there. And these characters who become elephants or animals or all this stuff in past lives are playing out some of the details of their real life lives. Yeah. And so you can look into the Jatakas and say, oh my God, there are these Jatakas of Yasodhara being raped. And that's not in the kind of straight stories, right? But I think that painful stuff was often buried into the Jatakas, and they were distanced from the real life stuff. But I take those very seriously when I see that. Who would come up with a story like that if it didn't come from some truth? I don't know the truth, but I take those stories seriously. So you kind of have to have a flexible mind when you look at all this stuff. It's really fun. I like it, and I don't have any problem going back and forth.
No, it's amazing. Every time Wendy and I talk, we just start going back and forth in the stories, and then we're all over the map with it. And there's just so many stories to tell. It's really an extraordinary material to enjoy. We only have a couple minutes before it's the question section. So before we do that, I just want to ask you one last question. If there's one takeaway, or one really important thing that you learned spending time with Mahaprajapati in your imagination and writing this book, what became the most important to you, or what do you want your readers or your audience to know about her?
Well, she was the foremother of Buddhism. I mean, there's no other second choice. And if it weren't for her, the Buddha's initial blueprint of the fourfold community wouldn't have come about. So I think she was a co-creator in many ways, and I don't say that lightly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one reason she was buried so deeply and written out of the story so much, not just because she was his mother, but because she was a really powerful figure, and she was a powerful, wonderful figure. You don't see her entering into her later roles in life with any arrogance or imperiousness. I mean, she's always the same authentic being. But if Buddhism needs women role models, well, you can't find anyone better than Mahaprajapati. She was a great mom, and she really went through the ringer as a mom. I mean, that's relevant to all moms. She shed a lot of tears over that kid, and yet she had to grow up herself and reconcile herself spiritually as a mother and as a disciple of her son, who then became the Buddha. But she never had a misstep, which could be idealized. But what else do we know? That's how the stories are told, and I'll take them that way until I read more stories, and then there'll be other angles on it. So I think if we're looking for role models, which we've had really none, she's a really great place to start for women and men. I mean, she belongs to the tradition, and I hate to genderize it, but it's been genderized. So I'm bringing her back, but she's for everybody.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful answer. And I think it's 100% true. And I think you're bringing a language that we haven't given her sufficiently. And so thinking of her as a co-mother, and then thinking of her as a co-creator of the tradition, I think this is really important language that we need to adopt and think about going forward, because I think you're right about that. I really do.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we're, would you guys like to field the questions, Rachel and David? Yeah. Okay.
Sure thing, Vanessa. Thanks so much. And This has been so fascinating. We've got a question here from Barb. She asks, Wendy, do you read Sanskrit or speak it? And in what language did you do your research?
Oh, good question. I studied Sanskrit quite a few years ago at UC Berkeley and was very immersed in the literature. And I would say at the time I was pretty accomplished. I didn't stay in the program, so I have all the skills, to kind of know how to look at it, know how to read it, know how to think it, but I didn't do any original translation for this. I could read translations critically, and what I would do as often as possible is find different translations of the same thing. So I read in English mostly, although if I found some Sanskrit I needed to work on, I had mentors I would work with. So I wouldn't say no, I wouldn't say I read in Sanskrit, but that is my background. I just didn't do enough of it to do my own translation. And that would have also made this a book that would have taken many lifetimes. Because also a lot of the texts I used had originally been in Sanskrit, but the Sanskrit and the Pali texts migrated throughout the Buddhist world. So a lot of what I was reading was from the Chinese that had been in Sanskrit. So I don't read Chinese, but today it might be in Chinese, or the Tibetan, or the Tocharian, or the Burmese, blah, blah, blah. Nobody reads all those languages. So I was finding translations and working with them, but I had some amazing mentors who were specialists in both Pali and Sanskrit. So when I had problems, I could say, is there any other way to look at this translation? Or what do you, I had really good feedback.
Fabulous, thank you. Linda asks, why were these stories initially buried?
Well, okay, let me give this a shot. Remember, I'll tell you that at the time of the Buddha, there was no literacy. So nothing was written down. That's kind of a big thought when you realize how much material there was, not only his teachings, but all these stories that emerged from the tradition. Nothing was written down. So they migrated for centuries, this information before it was written down. And then when it was written down, you'd have to ask, well, how did this story change over time? And then who was the person who wrote the story down? The person who wrote the story down, and I get a very strong sense of the difference. Some, let's call them scribes, editors. These were then finally, now we have a literate person. These were always men. It's just the fact of life. They were usually Brahmin men, if it was India. So it's kind of, and these were perhaps monks. So if there was stripping away of the feminine, it would kind of mirror their own experience as a male monastic. I think also women's stories were not considered really relevant to Buddha Dharma. The Buddha's childhood stories might not have seemed relevant to the Buddha Dharma. So they were not, or they were either changed, sometimes they were changed, or they just were ignored. I find in the traditions that did not seem to go through as much what I call the monastic filter, the male monastic filter, the patriarchal filter. It seems like there were scribes who just wrote down whatever they heard, and they didn't act as editors and redactors. And in those stories, you get more of the details. You get body details, you get humorous details, you get much more of a three-dimensional feeling to the stories and to the characters, because I feel that the people who initially wrote those stories down were not trying to edit what they heard. They were taking the stories from the storytellers and the bards and the oral traditions and just cobbling them into language. And I feel that was true more in the Sanskrit and the Northern traditions. And it's the same stories. It's just how they were treated once they came in. So, this was a patriarchal time, and monastic men all had to give up wives. They all had to go through what the Buddha went through. So it probably was part of their sense of duty or their sense of getting it right, just to strip away all that kind of messy family stuff and messy female stuff.
Thanks, Wendy. There's a question here from Kathy. She says, what are the 5 virtues that the Buddha assigned to women?
I don't remember them off the top. It came from a Tocharian manuscript fragment that was so fragmented, I don't think they were even intact. We know that he named 5 virtues, but the one that I used in that chapter and that I feel is the most important, and this was a corrective to the misogyny of the men who wouldn't let the women go to the teachings, is it was a corrective, and the virtues had to do with why women, well, should of course go to the teachings, but the one that really stuck with me is that all Buddhas are born from women. And that to me it just stopped me in my tracks that the Buddha would say that, and then the women went back out on the street and said, "You creeps," this is when the fur was flying, and the women were yelling at the men and the men were yelling at the women. And they said, "How dare you," and that sort of thing. But one of the 5 virtues that all the Buddhas were born of women. But I don't remember the others, and I'm not sure they're intact. And I haven't seen that in any other manuscript except the Tocharian. So it'd be nice to find it in other places.
That actually segues very perfectly to a really lovely comment that we got in the chat that I wanted to share with you. It's from Annie, and she says, "Dearest Wendy, I've dreamed some gifted one would one day bring these stories to light. Thank you for removing the pejorative for almost every single reference to women in our Buddhist history. So appreciate your treasure of a book. Thank you always."
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, my motive here, I hope, is that everyone will take these stories into the world. Don't keep them inside a book. Don't just keep it inside this little 1-hour chat. I think they do change Buddhism, because I think this is the way Buddhism was originally told. This is the way the stories were in the oral traditions before they got kind of frozen into the literature. And I see this as like seeds, and I urge everyone, if this moves you, take the stories out, and the next time you hear some of these kind of cliches or this sort of misogyny, you'll know you've heard maybe an alternative, and maybe speak, because I would love to see the paradigm shift. And I think it's kind of time.
Thanks so much, Wendy. There's another question here from Mary. She says, how was she ordained, and who performed the ordination?
That's in my chapter. Okay. Well, that story is told very differently. And so I can't tell you there's one answer, but what's fascinating, and I talked about consistency, is it's not consistent. So there are some stories, there are quite a few, that say that the women and Mahaprajapati all accepted the 8 Gaudamas, the 8, what are they, Vanessa, the 8 nasty rules, let's just call them the 8 nasties. They accepted the 8 Gaudamas simultaneously. So the fact that she was even the first Buddhist nun, it gets thrown into question. It seems as though all the women ordained simultaneously. In terms of who ordained the Buddha, who ordained Mahaprajapati, the Buddha, and that's in my book, makes a very strong statement that he was the one who ordained her. And this was when women, some nuns doubted that she'd been ordained, and they complained, and they felt that she was a false preceptor because she hadn't truly been ordained. I guess they had had a different ceremony, and they didn't witness hers. So they went to the Buddha and they complained, and this is recounted in Buddha Ghosha, who was one of the commentators of this period. And the Buddha just set them straight and said, she was ordained by me, and she is the preceptor of the nuns. And my theory on that, because her relationship with the 500 women she's usually identified with was always so warm and loving and friendly. These were women who had known each other their whole lives, that these dissenting women might have been from India, from a whole nother part of India, who they didn't know Mahaprajapati, and they might have just resented her role, and they hadn't witnessed her ordination, and they needed an explanation. But if you read that chapter, it's ambiguous exactly how it unfolded, but you end up realizing it's very clear that she was ordained by the Buddha, and she was named by the Buddha as chief nun, head preceptor and chief of nuns. When he lists the accomplishments in the Anuguttara Nikaya, he lists the accomplishments of the top tier of his fourfold community. He lists the top nuns, and she's number 1, and he lists her as foremost in seniority, and so forth. I don't think if you really read deeply, I mean, I'm sure there's some misogynist material that would have something to say about it, but it's pretty clear. It's just not the same story over and over. It's a little different. You have to get tolerant of all the contradiction and different versions of things. But again, as I said, because the oral tradition held this tradition that went this way might have altered the story a little bit that way. It's like telephone, the game of telephone, you know, it doesn't come out the same.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy. I mean, we are just about, unfortunately, out of time, but there are been a couple more really sweet statements in the chat, comments. Annie says, "Dear Wendy, ripples are the promises that waves make to the flood. Your book begins a tsunami." And Anusha says, "I feel like this book will be an amazing reference for us all to refer to for understanding the importance of the feminine principle." Thank you for your amazing work.
That's great, you guys. I can't see you, but I love you. Thank you. Tell the stories.
Wendy, Vanessa, thank you so much. This has been a lovely event. The book is The Woman Who Raised the Buddha, and you can order it from Northshire on northshire.com. Wendy's got the cover right there. We've got the link in the chat. And thank you all so much and have a great evening. We'll see you in another Northshire event.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you and have a great night.
Bye.